Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. Yeah, looking forward to our session this afternoon. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes for other people to join, and then we can get started. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, let us know where you're joining from. Tell us your name, what organization you work with, and we can start some discussion in there. And then, as always, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll get to them towards the end of the session. Great. Hello, everyone who's just joined. Thanks for coming to our session this afternoon on data portals of the future. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, but in the meantime, if you'd like to introduce yourself on the chat, please do so, and we'll get started in just 2 more minutes. Okay, we'll just give it 1 more minute, but please do feel free to keep introducing yourself. Thanks to everyone who's joined already. Um, and yeah, looking forward to our discussion. Kick off in just about a minute or so. Okay, I think we might make a start. Hello everyone, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. This is the 13th webinar in our data-centric AI series, and in this edition, we're going to be discussing data portals of the future with a panel discussion focused on data accessibility, in the new tech world we find ourselves in. Before we start, I'm Joe Massey, a senior researcher here at the ODI, where I've done lots of work thinking about how organizations can steward data, and in particular AI data, for the benefit of the public. And I'm going to be the panel chair for today. I'm going to introduce the panelists in a bit, but first, a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is going to be recorded and shared via social media, as well as in our email newsletters. It's also going to be archived on the ODI website and on YouTube. We might use some of the quotes and extracts from the recording of this webinar in future ODI communications. And then, as I already mentioned, we really recommend and encourage that you submit your own questions to our amazing panel today. If there's anything you want to ask them, please do use the Q&A functionality on this Zoom webinar. Pop those questions in the chat. And then just to say that the ODI team are going to be in the chat throughout this webinar if there's anything that you might need. So please do feel free to reach out. So this is the 13th webinar of our Data-Centric AI series, a program where we share our own work at the ODI and invite experts from around the world to tell us their key insights and recommendations for building the socio-technical data infrastructure needed to make AI work for all of us. You can find the recordings of our previous webinars with experts from technology companies, academia, and the public sector on our YouTube channel. And today's recording is going to be made available as well in a couple of weeks once the closed captions have been added. I believe the link to all of the different webinars is going to be shared in the chat, so have a little look on there. So I'm going to now introduce our brilliant panel for today. To start off with, I'm delighted to be joined by Ian McGill, an entrepreneur who's worked in public procurement for over 25 years. As the founder of Spend Network, he has built the world's first open database of public procurement, which is the world's largest open contracting data standard database. He now runs Open Opportunities, a website with public sector tenders and contracts globally that customers can access in order to bid for work that they may not have been aware of. Hey, Ian, great to have you with us today.
Nice to be on board, Joe. Thank you for inviting me along. And it's nice to see some familiar faces and names joining us today. So yeah, it's lovely to be part of it.
Brilliant. We're also joined by Antonia Panayotova, Head of Product for data.gov.uk at the UK Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. Antonia has worked across the data.gov.uk team, exploring user interactions and how the government's data portal needs to transform for the AI age. Hi, Antonia. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for inviting me. Really lovely to be here. Really lovely to see some familiar names among the attendees, and also how international this audience is. Hopefully, we can be helpful.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's something we really love at the ODI, seeing people join us from all over the world. And last but not least, we have Professor Eleanor Simpel, one of the UK's leading advocates for AI that is transparent, trustworthy, and truly human-centered. As the ODI's Director of Research and co-director of King's College London's Institute for Artificial Intelligence, she is in the AI Minor top 2,000 most influential scholars in AI in the world, and is the UK's expert on building AI that works for people rather than just on them. Hi, Eleanor. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. That 2% quote, Joe, is really, really hard to check. So I thought I would just put it into my CV. But I'm reminded that I might want to have another look at it at some point. So you've mentioned, I'm really glad to be here. Also, despite the fact that you've mentioned AI a few times in my bio, I promised to talk about data as well, not just AI. But very excited, very looking forward to this conversation because it's a great topic.
Brilliant. So during this panel, there's going to be opportunity for you, the audience, to ask any questions you like. So again, just please feel free to send in any questions that you have throughout the conversation in the Q&A or chat part of Zoom over the course of the session, and we'll get to them towards the end, and we can find out what all of our brilliant panelists think about your questions. So on to the main event. There we go. Okay, hopefully we can see everyone now. So I wanted to start a little bit broad and to first ask Eleanor about data portals themselves. What are they? What have they historically looked like? And why are they so important?
Okay, so I'm an academic, right? So like I've never built a data portal in my life. But I can talk about it. And in fact, I've been in the great position to being asked to advise over time various public authorities on how and other public sector and public interest data sets on the design of their portals. So data portals are the tool we have right now to publish data sets for wider use. Data portals are also ideally one of the main means of access for people, organizations who are looking for data in various contexts. You may have heard about related concepts like a data repository, which I think is more or less the same thing. A data catalog, which typically refers to the way you classify different data sets. So you would expect to have a list or some sort of hierarchy of data sets with some additional information. That additional information sometimes is referred to as metadata, especially if it is machine readable. So used also by algorithmic or digital systems in some way. A portal is different from, say, a search engine. So you may have heard about Google Dataset Search. There's many other search engines in various verticals. A search engine basically is creating an index of various datasets published on various sites. A portal is much more about a certain organization or institution designing a product for people to find and make sense of dataset resources.
Excellent. That's a very nice overview to get us started on this panel. Antonia and Ian, you've both got plenty of experience of data portals in the government context. So I'm going to start with Antonia. What was kind of what do you see as the underlying motivation for the government to be publishing data through portals? and what was behind the original data.gov.uk initiative. Obviously, we've seen that there's been a little refresh recently, so also interested in what's new and what needed to change.
Of course. Thank you, Joe. I won't claim I was there when this was first founded, although I do know one of the ODI founders was. I have spoken to a bunch of the previous product leaders on this topic, and I've been in the data transformation and government space for the last 5 or 6 years, so I've learned a little bit along the way. But from the very start, Data.gov.uk specifically was about innovation and transparency. There was a lot of thinking around how if we make more data available, people can innovate with it, it can stimulate the economy, it can grow great startups. But there was also really big mandate and support around the transparency agenda and government being more open to citizens and journalists and others can verify that the right things are happening at the right times at the right places. It was quite a golden age for open data. There was a lot of improvements being driven. That was in the early 2010s, just to be very clear, which I can't believe it's like 16 years ago, goodness. There was a lot of excitement. And it was around shortly after the launch of Data.gov.uk that the Open Government License was established and started to push really all departments into opening that data. The initial response of the launch of Data.gov.uk and open data wasn't what people expected. I think many people forget that. There was a lot of excitement that suddenly all these opportunities, the product's going to go live and all these opportunities within a week will start to be realized. We know that never actually happens in this way. It takes time to build up the behaviors and get there. But the team focused on trying to get more open data. There was less focus on the quality and of what this data is, because they were working in a space where there was very little open data. So the focus was, let's get as much of it out there as possible. And among this, there will be some that is really good in quality. I think over time, that's my read of it, kind of overwhelmed the space and started to, the sheer quantity of it, where not all of it was of the right quality, started to take away some of the excitement in the people working with data and in the senior leadership that was promoting these behaviors and this new agenda. And very closely after that, the digital transformation across all governments around the world started and really took off and took over. I can see, however, now, so I'm thinking back to that and then comparing it to today. So I can see some of that excitement again, which makes me really excited. I think that's part of, we're thinking, obviously the services transformation agenda took over. But the next steps in that, at least in government, is how do we then start to join up the services across organizational boundaries? And a lot of that is dependent on data. At the same time, obviously, we're in the age of AI, as some of what we will talk about today. And that has really put data at the forefront of things. And it is, again, this exciting moment where people do care about data and are trying to avoid the pitfalls of what happened before. In our current world, that means focusing on quality more. So that is one key lesson we've taken from before, and thinking of like, what is the most used data, which seems to be quite a small subset, but to create quite a lot of opportunities, and how can we focus on this and make this the most accessible while still keeping data open that is probably less relevant to everyone. They might have few users, because sometimes these are the kind of things that spark ideas and innovation. And you will see some of that in the new things that came across the data.gov.uk. We're focusing, we did a release this week, the first of many to come. It's just the start of our transformation. And it focuses on these data collections where we're trying to group these high quality, highly used data so people can find them straight away. But we're still keeping and are going to be improving the directory that has existed before, that might have data sets that, someone might use once a year, but that might spark the right ideas. We're building this on the shoulder of giants, those who did the open data agenda, who started to open data so that we can do what we are doing now and focus on the quality. And there is a lot of work to do, but it's really exciting to be in the space.
Brilliant. Thanks, Antonia. Ian, I think you're a very well placed person to talk about data accessibility and importantly, what that accessibility enables. So what do government data portals allow to happen for business, startups, the economy, and society more broadly?
Um, well, I mean, I think it's a really, especially today, as life is changing and we're seeing um, before our eyes this idea of data becoming kind of malleable and interchangeable and enhanced, enriched as in the moment. I think that's changing, but I think the the really good things about data portals are ground truth. We act as an archivist, really. I just gather up as much of the data as I can, structure it in the best way that I can, and then present it back. And one of the benefits that we have is because we look at a particular niche of data, we can run a search engine that is very specific to the needs of our users. Something like data.gov has a different set of challenges, right? And they have to run much more general tools. So that I think is the that thing of standing on the shoulders is that actually what good government data does is stand as a benchmark or a baseline upon which to build. And I think that was always the intention of data.gov. And the good portals aren't there just to say, oh, look at the data we've got. It's more to be able to say, actually, if you do a really good thing, you'll look at this data, you'll ingest it, and you'll come back to us with a solution to a problem that we didn't know we had. So those are the sorts of things that I think go really well. Actually, one of the things that Antonio was mentioning was about how the aspiration was different from actually what happened in the end. I think some of that is down to the fact that we kept putting up technology without recognizing that the act of publication is a discipline. And we've failed to often, the expectation was, okay, District Council X will be able to meet their requirements of publishing data without any training or capacity or understanding beyond what an Excel spreadsheet looks like into creating a kind of a theory of what transparency is and putting that into practice. And so I think there's still a long journey to go into making good data a practice that is part of being a civil servant or being part of government.
Yeah, agree. And speaking of standing on the shoulders of giants, on our last webinar, we spoke quite a lot and sung the praises of gov.uk and the development principles that made it as useful 20 years ago as it is today. But with data.gov, it's a bit of a different picture, especially in the context of AI. So Eleanor, we want to know a little bit more about what does it mean for data to be AI ready? What will it take for general purpose AI to interact with government data?
All right. So there's a lot to unpack there, Joe, but definitely an interesting question. And in fact, at the ODI over the last year or so, we've been thinking about this as part of our project on AI ready government data, and I'm sure the colleagues can share some of the frameworks and findings in this space. But let me just take a step back. So why does it matter to think about AI in relation to data portals? For various reasons. First and foremost, because the ways in which people access information is changing. So if you're thinking about data discovery, data set discovery, 5 to 10 years ago, you'd have typically two types of user journeys. You'd have the users who would go the regular search engine, type some keywords about maybe a question they had that is somehow related to a data set, like a statistical type of question, or maybe indeed they were looking for a data set of a certain authority, and people would just go to the search engine because that was the quickest way to find that data set, especially if they didn't know on which portal to look for it. And then there was a second category of users. You would go to a site like the Office of National Statistics or data.gov.uk and would start their search journey there. Now this is changing. Journeys that used to start on the web in a search engine are now starting in a chatbot. People expect those types of conversational experiences. And if you look at the latest statistics published by OpenAI and Anthropic, some of the queries that people are asking could be classified as data queries, whether that's a question that could be answered by a data set or a combination of data sets, or is actually a query for a source of data specifically. So as an owner or a steward of a data portal, you've invested a lot of time and energy and creativity in building this resource. So you need at least to be aware about those new types of user journeys and think about how would you make sure that people still find you and are able to download those nuggets of good data that you have published. Secondly, on data portals as well, you could argue people who are used now to have natural language conversations with digital tools will expect the same type of experience there as well, which is very interesting because we all know from a user-centric point of view that type of keyword-based faceted search that traditional portals used to implement has certain limitations for various reasons that I'm not going to elaborate right now. And to some extent, that can be mitigated with the type of data storytelling, data curation that I've seen now on data.gov.uk and also London Data Store and other portals used to do. But people expect flexibility, right? So then that question about how does a conversational data experience look like is quite interesting. Beyond that, then there is a question about how the data sets that a portal indexes are used by general purpose chatbots to answer questions. And there, the ODI has done a bit of work in trying to assess whether these data sets are used in so-called citizen queries, so questions that people have about public services. And colleagues could hopefully share a link to that. And we've come up with a number of recommendations to make it more or less likely for, say, an AI agent to really find the files in a dataset distribution enticing to use, rather than actually preferring, for whatever reasons of technical formats and others, to pick that information from somewhere else. And that matters because, as Ian was saying, this is a source of ground truth. And we're not talking about any ground truth. We're talking about ground truth about government services. So in a democracy, you would want to make sure that that information also reaches citizens. So I think these are a number of dimensions. Each of them is complex, and the situation is quite fluid and emerging because I don't think we have seen yet the latest on what these new AI capabilities are going to be used for, but is definitely asking a few interesting questions in terms of what data portals could or should look like.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of excitement recently over the last few years about AI and its potential and the way it's changing our information environment. But ultimately, I suppose initially data portals have been built for human users. And Antonio, it'd be really interesting to hear from you about how you see these human users and their interactions with data.gov.uk. Are they changing? Are you seeing the patterns that Eleanor alluded to in her answer?
I just want to say human users is such an odd term, but I do recognize it is the times. Okay, this is a passion for me, so stop me if I'm going on too long. we, as you know, with the redesign we did recently, we did a lot of research initially looking at what we know from before, what is happening at local and international products that can be comparable. And then we started with this baseline survey of current users of DataGov.UK and moderated testing to really try and understand how much things have changed, how much they're the same. And this is where I'm speaking from here. There is still very engaged and very diverse users. And when I say very diverse, I do mean it. We would hear from someone who was retired and wanted to verify road nodes in their area after seeing a documentary, a custom specialist who was looking for bulk data on imports, or a researcher from Botswana looking for British plant images. It is incredibly diverse. And though these people are still going to these portals, some of them are going, as Elena said, through the chatbot. Some of them are going through searches, as they have historically, and some of them are going directly through links and still linked through other websites that they're using. So people have established behaviors they're still banking on. We have grouped them a bit, and there's a few things that are true for all users. They all want to find and get to data quicker, regardless of the behavior, and they often give up on DataGov.UK anyways. They give up because they feel overwhelmed and because some of the data is bad, the links are bad, they're broken, and so on. We're still finding the majority use Google and other search engines. There is increasingly more AI tools taking people to the portal. It's still not the majority, but it is a steady rise, and we can definitely notice that. They want to get the data in the format they want it in, and we have seen some new formats start to become prevalent with AI tools that people are interested in. That when previously it was slightly different formats. We sometimes talk about technical users, but we found different types of technical users. So the more analyst type versus the more developer type might want slightly different formats. And if we were to really achieve the goals of with data that we have set out, we need to provide for all. As I mentioned before, there is always one or two users that find this odd data that no one else uses, but it is really helpful to them, and we still are finding we need to make this available. With anything government, there seems to be really high trust in the data, even when the data is not performing, is what we've noticed in our recent research. And for me, that means that we have a responsibility that we need to uphold of making sure it is better. What else? So these are the things in terms of search, of format. I think a lot of them are based, again, on the basics of how people use portals. Even in the age of AI, you still need that. And ultimately, what matters most, we've found, is not so much not necessarily even having the chatbot. At the end of the day, what matters is them getting to the data and being able to use it. And if they can get that through a chatbot, that's perfect. That's the peak experience that they can expect. But even if they didn't have that, what would annoy them more is having a chatbot giving them wrong information than not having this at all and just having good raw data. And this is what we are working with at the moment.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's super interesting, and I think could be some extensive discussion about calling them human users, but we'll have to stick with it for now. Just a reminder to everyone in the audience: if you have questions for the panelists, please do put them in the chat. We're going to get to them in about 10 or 15 minutes. So, as with all things AI, there's plenty of opportunity, and there's also plenty of challenges out there as well. And so, Ian, we wanted to talk a little bit about how AI-generated content can start to proliferate through open contribution data portals, which can lead to increased workloads for moderators, deteriorating trust in infrastructure. And you might have seen a fair bit of this when it comes to tenders and procurement. So really curious to hear about your perception of this issue and what the future looks like.
Oh, a small topic then. I think this is what you've hit on something that I think is a real challenge, particularly for governments. If you imagine what an MP's inbox must look like at the moment, and there is no off switch, right, for this. the ability now for someone to send an extensive email, endless reams of text, like thousands and thousands of words, and a commitment on the other end that is either bound by legislation or by function to respond to that input, I think is quite a challenging problem for governments of all types. Moving on to procurement, there is that sense that, okay, yes, we can control how many words you are given in a response, but they can't in government limit the number of responses you receive. And our data clearly shows an uptick in the number of responses. Speaking to procurement professionals, they're sort of getting very frustrated with anodyne boilerplate bids that are, you know, the equivalent of flinging mud at the wall. And I and I can feel their pain, right? I can comprehend it. What I do think has to happen, I think the mistake is necessarily to assume that the answer, so we see it in recruitment, you know, like cover letter, CV, all written perfect for the job, and it goes into a bot that says throw it away, right? So, you know, and at this point you just think, well, the planet deserves better, right, than that process. But I think that if you think about procurement and the ways that's working, I would be inclined to start thinking that actually this is a two-way street. Yes, you are going to want, we've been saying for years, we want SMEs to bid on stuff, and there is a way these tools actually possibly help SMEs run more compliant, less, you know, they make the task less onerous, those kind of things. So all of that is good. I think buyers also need to, frankly, stop asking for 2,000 words on open-ended subjects like, why do you think you'll be good for this contract? Well, you know, if you put that together, you're going to get what you deserve, right? Which is 2,000 words. And then you can't going to complain about, you know, reading that. Well, that's what you asked for. So I think there are ways in which government and certainly that's one example, but government is going to have to adjust. What becomes, I think, it becomes really interesting in this space is when citizens themselves can do what Elena was talking about, which is to go to data portals, pull down information that is relevant to the customer, to the buyer, say, look, we've looked at this information, we've aligned your priorities based on your data to a solution that will meet your needs, and this is how we're going to do it. And instead of actually, so the other part of this is the more data you publish about what you want and in a procurement context, but also the more data that's out there, the less time you're going to spend going, here is my answer to your question, which is one of 10,000 other answers, 10,000 other questions that I have to answer. So publication of good data becomes preemptively a solution to this flood of information, potentially. I mean, you know, there's a pull, it's a two-way street, but I think that, you know, good data solves a lot of these problems.
I'm seeing a lot of nods and a curious face from Eleanor there. So I don't know if she has anything to come in on.
I'm just making notes because this is a very rich conversation. So, I kept on thinking about other, and to be honest, Antonia, I haven't had a look. I haven't had time to have a look at the roadmap. So if these are things that you already have on the roadmap, great minds think alike. If not, just ignore me. So I was thinking about, aside from the AI hype, which, as you were saying, Joe, can be an opportunity, but we've heard also from Ian that we also need to be prepared for a world where, I don't know, data requests, for instance, will, just like freedom of information requests, will be are created and submitted and possibly filtered as well at the other end, in a different way. So those loops of engagement with people are changing as well. But I was thinking about data sets, and I was thinking about, and I think that, and that's, I believe, something that the DataGov UK team and others, other portal owners are thinking about, and that's the ability to bring together not just open data, but also data that will never make it into the public domain. That doesn't mean they would share that information, that data set, with the public, but you would have the metadata published on that portal at least, and what that would mean is actually that it would give a potential user a more complete picture of the landscape of data resources available to solve a particular problem, right? So this is something that we've seen very, very early on in the history of open government data, which is now almost 15 years old. I remember when I was running the Open Data Incubator program back at Southampton. This was a European program where the ODI was also involved, where we were essentially managing a fund, managing grants for startups and SMEs to use open government data, and we were all open government data enthusiasts, and we thought, okay, this is going to be great. But very quickly, we've seen that actually those startups, those businesses wanted to solve specific problems of their clients. And those problems almost never were just solved exclusively with open government data sets. So I think it's great that now we've got to this point where this is going to happen. I think the second point I would make, and this is more of a question to the audience and to my colleagues here, is whether we think there is an opportunity for AI to improve on the quality of the data that we can publish. And of course, you'd imagine something where perhaps the more substantial use of AI would be labeled and documented very well for people to understand the provenance of the data. But people may be looking for synthetic data sets. People may be looking for good synthetic data sets, well-designed synthetic data sets. Do we think this is potentially a new species of data we would see on data portals? I'm taking your job, I'm sorry, Joe.
You're doing a good job. Antonia, do you have
Any
thoughts on
thoughts?
that question?
I do, on the previous one as well. So around bringing in data that isn't necessarily open, and that we have nodded at that on our roadmap. There is some thinking. But to be honest, what you suggested about describing data that is not open, that it exists, is a feature that was on data.gov.uk historically.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I should have looked more carefully.
No, it's okay. I think you're representing what we've seen users represent as well. The fact that it isn't open means that people haven't really gone to it, and then it hasn't placed really well in searches, and then it's kind of reinforced it's not being visible. So we're looking at what that, if we what are we learning from this, and if we were to do something again, is it the metadata or is it something else that we present to make sure it is actually maximizing use? This is currently our driving goal, is how do we make sure people can use useful data? And that could be open or not, but it is kind of the guiding principle behind our decisions. And in terms of the AI improvements, I think that is really interesting. I've spoken to a few teams around government mostly already who are testing things like that. And it's really interesting to see. The testing so far hasn't wielded the best results. It is not quite the quality we would expect, but it is getting there. It is getting there fairly quickly. So I don't think it is far off. And it's certainly really interesting thing for us, because that can take away, some people in chat earlier mentioned data owners, and I think that can take away from the effort that is placed on data owners to make sure this is maintainable, and it can like make sure that it is something that can stay and be updated and be good, even with us putting less and less effort into it over the years. And that's what I'm really excited about with automation and AI tools and instruments.
If I may just come in on this, because you talked about metadata. So we were with my PhD students at King's, we've been doing some experiments into this, because like your colleagues in government, we really wanted to know whether that helps or not. And it's an evolving situation, but basically what we have seen, we first looked at which attributes in the metadata, say in a DCAT a record of a data set, are most useful in conversational search, and it's the description. So it's not the title, it's not the keyword, it's that description that yields the highest improvement. But then what we've also done, we've done some experiments on trying to generate the metadata automatically, and then essentially we've prompted various LLMs with a title, with a schema of the data set, with the sample, and basically we've realized, because of the formats mostly, that you can forget the schema, and essentially a title is in most cases enough to generate something reasonably good. And if you add some examples, then in some cases you may be able to come to a reasonably good standard for metadata quality. But that, again, different vendors of these models vary. So it's worth actually testing a few and trying to understand, because they seem to exhibit very stable, let's say, metadata personalities. So it's an evolving picture, really.
It will be really interesting to see more from your work on this. And I think the descriptions made me think, so one, I did mention we're doing curated collections of high quality data. One of the things we're doing in those collections is curating the descriptions ourselves. We have tested a lot of them with the data owners and made sure that they are representative, but in a way we're standardizing what we expect from a description. And that is one area we have identified as something we want to test the use of AI in early, because large language model seems to perform really well on this kind of task. So it'll be really good to see some of your work. I'm sorry for taking over this conversation.
No worries at all. Ian, I don't know, did you want to come in on any of that?
I think, this comes back to this idea that the act of publishing data is still a discipline. What becomes more interesting now is that, especially with large amounts of data, you can use LLMs to really spot where data is poor and help publishers produce better data, automate the production of metadata, and say, well, look, actually, we understand that this is about this, but there are shortcomings here. We years ago, when all the spend data was on data.gov.uk, we used to pull down a data set. I won't name the departments, but you would get something like 20,000 lines one month, and then something terrible like 3,000 lines the next month. And if you ever had the temerity to go and say, well, what's going on here? They would go, well, we can only tell you if you send us an FOI, meaning, you're on a 9-month journey to ask, actually, can you do a better job of this? So I think that it does, we're able now to query data sets in real time and then go, okay, yeah, there may be an anomaly here. Or as a publisher, you can start to say, well, look, we're looking at this stuff and going, there's an inconsistency here. Are you sure you want to publish this? And I don't want to be the person who stands in front of reluctant government publishers anyway, but I think there are mechanisms around compliance and analysis that make for a richer experience. When it comes to actually retrieving data from data sets, there is that. What I think is most interesting is saying, look, all data is, you have to accept by nature, all data is imperfect. But what can we do? And this is the job that we do all the time, which is say, well, look, I'm going to take what you give me and I'm going to enrich it. And I'm going to enrich it in ways that perhaps you might not have seen. Now, what we haven't started to see yet is that flow back into the publisher. And I think that's a really, really interesting opportunity because we're enriching data, making it more surfaceable, finding it, pulling in other information about it, pulling out factors, and can we give that back to the public sector in return for money, yes, but actually can we give that back to the public sector in return for better data in the future? Well, now that's really interesting. I don't want money in that case. Give me better data, so a better flow. Then that looks interesting.
Yeah, that that cyclical relationship that you're alluding to kind of takes us very nicely on to some of the great questions we've had from the audience. So I'm gonna pivot us towards what we've had in the chat. So to start off with, first question that we had was around how data portals, some of the criticisms of data portals might be that they operate as one-way streets where lots of consultation happens behind closed doors, and there's not necessarily a chance for the public to be involved or others to be involved in design or making decisions about what they look like and how they work. What sort of feedback mechanisms might allow citizens and users to voice concerns and then actually see how their input actually shapes data on existing data portals? Do we have any examples of what that might look like?
I can jump in quickly with what we are doing now, and then I'll let others come in. So I found that question really interesting, also because it asks specifically about at the data level, are we doing this? I'm really like the idea of working in the open, because I do think that when you can hear from a wide variety of people that are really interested in the subject matter, you can make products much better. And we are really trying to do this with the new releases on Data.gov UK. We've embedded 3 different parts of feedback in the feedback forms to tell us about other data you want to see, to tell us about what you like or don't like about designs, to tell us about the policies and how we can support people in following those better. And those are open to anyone. So that's first. I invite you to please go and tell us about it there. The other things I've seen specifically at the data level has been users, and I do recognize Elena mentioning it's probably not necessarily always the best term, but stepping away from that, users potentially estimating how good the data is. There is some challenges to this from portals we've spoken to in my team that are using or have used and then decided to drop this, where it is highly subjective depending on what you are using the data for, and users can vary quite significantly for the same data set. But it could also, there are ways to do it, and there is some open portals we've seen where they're doing this in almost like a Reddit-esque way, with upvoting and downvoting and commenting. Could be quite interesting. It is things that are on my mind and I'm thinking of, because I do think in getting your community engaged can lead to better results, but we do need to do some validation around that, especially in the age of AI, where a lot of it is not necessarily human generated.
Absolutely. Eleanor, I feel like you have thoughts on this.
So I agree with Antonia that there's many things people have tried, and it is not for lack of trying that we don't see more options to create those feedback loops and engage those communities. I think it's also worth reminding ourselves that data portals like DataGov.uk, like Kaggle, for instance, which also has open data sets, but for a very different purpose, they are broad churches. So they are about bringing together various types of data sets, sharing. Maybe I'm thinking about it in terms of a department store with many different types of things that you can get there. You go to John Lewis because you know it has everything. Yeah. As opposed to you go to a specialist store, say OpenStreetMap or Fix My Street, or very specific data set. So in those communities, right? So you can implement, you're quite certain about what people's motivations are to submit that sort of data, to access that sort of data. And from a design point of view, you can implement other types of engagement. Whereas with a broad portal, it is a bit different, right? So if you look at Kaggle, for instance, they have done exactly what Antonia was saying. So they've worked with discussions, they've worked with different types of voting mechanisms. By the way, they've also done a lot of user research to understand from the 40 attributes in their metadata vocabulary, which 3 ones are most important both for them and for users, and have thought about the user interface and how they could encourage publishers to really have excellent metadata in those 3 attributes. That's also quite interesting, I think. But it's a different community, right? So that's a different community. That's a community of learners who are, for whom a data set is just a means to an end, and they want to know about this data set, and they want to then take this other data set. And lots of the choice is really more about the modality of the data set, the size of the data set, rather than solving a real world problem. The other interesting example I had was a company called Data.World, which I think was now bought by ServiceNow, Salesforce, ServiceNow. So they used to do a lot to encourage conversations around data. People were sharing queries, were sharing all sorts of additional information to facilitate engagement with the data set. But it was a much more technical, enterprise-centric community as well. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that many things have been tried. There's also the question about how Gen AI changes those interactions, because open data infrastructure is not free to use. It's quite resource intensive. And in some cases, the more where especially you know more about the reasons why people come to your data product, like in the examples I had, you have perhaps better and more specific tools to engage with them. But it sounds from what Antonia was saying that there's 3 different types of feedback channels that are being tested. So it would be interesting actually for me as an academic also to know what are people asking for, because no one has good benchmarks for conversational dataset discovery. And you can't get them from query logs like we used to, because those are keyword based. So any means researchers like myself and people who are caring about conversational data experiences would have to have a more realistic way to think about building purpose-made tools for this, would be great.
Sounds like a whole nother project we can look forward to working on. So we got another question here from someone in the chat that works at a small NGO operating a niche data portal on land governance issues to help people around the world to better defend their land rights. They're seeing massive crawling by bots, decreased visits by humans, and decreased support from donors. Are we entering an era where the only ones able to handle the stress of open data and publishing and everything that goes along with it? Are we entering an era where only governments are going to be able to take on that stress and be the only ones publishing data openly? Ian, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yes, none of which may be that useful. Right. But let me put it, so I think the really interesting, the sort of the bellwether, it's probably not a bellwether. The poster boy of this problem is actually Tailwind CSS. I don't know if you've come across this, but they're a product that helps people build websites. And all of their documentation is online, and anyone can go and use their tool to make websites in a form it's easier to use CSS, right? Part of the coding behind a website, the styling. And what they've discovered is that because Claude and ChatGPT can now write perfect Tailwind, they're laying off developers left, right, and center because no one is buying their product, because their products were based on actually helping people, giving support to users and developers to help use their product. And so there's now this massive gap because the AI has basically just stolen their business model. And I think that it's going to be really hard. We're going to have to adjust to this idea that actually, if we're producing useful data and the AI is taking it and using it and not crediting you, what does that do? How do we generate a referenceability that says, okay, well, does the AI pay? Should OpenAI pay to Tailwind some money, or to the person asking the question? And if so, what? They don't even know how often they're relying on the data. So it's a very difficult problem. What I think is really what has to happen is, if this is part of your business case, you give up a certain amount of information, and then you say, if you want real information, you come to us. You do that this way. I think so. Wrapping services around data is probably the way that goes. But I think it's a really, really difficult challenge that we haven't got to the bottom of. You want bots to discover you, but then they're discovering too much about you. What do you do then? So it's a challenge that I don't have a complete answer to, I'm afraid.
That's all right. We weren't expecting you to solve everything for us, Ian. Don't worry. But I suppose, in this example, we heard of a very niche data portal, very niche data set. So are we losing some of that richness of the open data ecosystem? Are we losing? Is everything needing to become more centralized into government portals, for example? Antonio, what do you think?
I think, looking at the question, I really don't think it's a problem just for smaller organizations. I think it's a problem in government as well. I don't think it's a secret for anyone. The fiscal environment is tight, and we need to make sure we're investing in things that will generate value and therefore improve people's lives and outcomes. I think I've heard people in different environments talk about data valuation and how we make sure we make the right choices. And when we're talking about innovation, we can never know for sure what's going to go down. It's great to talk about replicating the successes of transport apps and back in the day, but a lot of it happened by some chance and some encouragement. It's a bit of a mix of both, in my opinion. But I do think, with how much the volume of data is growing, how much data we're generating in the world, in government and outside of government, we'll need to make choices about what we invest in and what we don't, and what we open and what we don't, because it's just not. It might well not be the best use of money to make everything open. That might not get us anywhere, but that does probably lead to a reduced variety. So I don't know what the answer is and what the balancing point is, but it is something that's keeping me up at night as well.
So I think I guess there's the underlying question of incentives for data publishers. What is the reason why they might want to share data openly? And we had a question in the chat that's, suggesting that, agreeing with some of the discussion earlier around the need for data quality, and kind of some of the points Ian alluded to around how difficult and hard work it can be to publish data in a certain format or of a certain quality. So in the age of AI, Eleanor, what do you think are the incentives for organizations to publish data openly on data portals?
Well, I think there is an argument about why would we need access to free knowledge? And while I absolutely understand the need to consider some form of control and gatekeeping of the data. Not alone because without that, it will end up in some models which will create more slop, which will essentially over time erode the whole ecosystem. But aside from that, I think that argument that giving people access to educational resources, to information resources they can trust, is good for humanity. Access to education and data is part of that, is a good thing and remains a good thing. I'm not saying everyone should do it. I also think infrastructure costs more money than ever to run. Though I would say, I mean, people point fingers at a number of companies. I would say this is a widespread behavior. And there's thousands, tens of thousands of players who are responsible for this behavior here. So that may change because people will realize that's not the way to make a profit from AI. And if that happens, then maybe, we got away easily. Then though public infrastructure is under a lot of strain and has been under a lot of strain. So what's the incentive? Still the same incentive as why Wikipedia is still a good thing, I would say. The same applies to open government data. And also because at the end of the day, it does create that innovation ecosystem. Authority and good data matters in those use cases for which open government data is used. And having that source of authority requires a data set, not a vector representation of the data in a probabilistic machine. Even if that probabilistic machine would be owned by a nation.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the best stewards of that data remain public authorities.
A lovely way to wrap us up, Eleanor.
Joe, can
Unfortunately,
I?
we've just run out of time, Ian. I think we need to
Oh,
close it off on the hour, unfortunately. But we will find a way for you to share your responses, and we'll get back to everyone because there's a few questions we didn't quite get to, so we'll find a way to share our answers to those as well. And apologies
Means
for
we need
running
a
out of
part
time.
two.
We need part two. Part two. Watch this space. So, I mean, yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today, to the participants. It was a fantastic discussion, and I hope you all found it as engaging as I did. Keep an eye out for the next webinar in this series. They're coming thick and fast, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.